Hi, I'm Georgia, and I live in LA, and this is my walk away video. So I have voted Democrat my entire life, but I walked away in about December of 2018. And it was hard for me to make this video because I know kind of how people feel about conservatives, especially if they're Trump voters. And, I didn't really want to think that people would be feeling that way about me. But that's actually why I think it's really important to make this video. When I kind of busted out of the Democrat echo chamber, that's when I realized like how warped and inaccurate my whole perception of conservatives was. And I want to kind of make this video to help explain to some people like the things that I didn't understand maybe in 2016. So I was born and raised in Massachusetts in like a pretty progressive community or in a pretty progressive environment. And like a lot of people who grow up in like blue states, I was raised basically to be a Democrat. So, from a young age, I was kind of taught this story about American politics. And the story kind of goes, Democrats are the good guys. They are looking out for the little guy. And Republicans are the bad guys. They are for the rich. They maybe like exploit. They're bigots. In the case of women, it's like they want to control your body, etc. And this whole story is very emotionally resonant, especially for like a teenager when you kind of learn it, because it kind of taps into that idea of like good versus evil, and you want to kind of be on the side of good. And if I'm really honest, probably the only issue that I even leaned left on really growing up was gay marriage. And in Massachusetts in the early 2000s, this was kind of like a hot button issue for us. And I had gay friends at school. And so for me, like I was totally pro gay marriage. And so that was basically the thing that made me decide that I was going to be a Democrat. And I didn't really, to be honest, know too much else about the platform. Even from the start, and certainly during like my early years in adulthood, there were kind of cracks in this story and things that made me have my doubts. And my whole walkaway story is basically like the story of me ignoring those clues, ignoring the cracks, and just like putting them aside until I kind of reached this point in 2018 that I couldn't anymore. Like it was too much. It's almost embarrassing to kind of tell you about like all the things that I ignored. But that's kind of the story of this whole walkaway thing, is like all those things that we ignored until we couldn't ignore them anymore. And that was kind of what happened to me. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in. When I was 22, I graduated college and I joined this program called Teach for America. So I've always been very passionate about educational equality, and this program was basically a program that trains teachers and puts them in low-income schools to help turn those schools around. And what I didn't know at that time was that Teach for America, or TFA, was kind of becoming like a very woke organization. So like in 2020, you probably kind of know what I mean when I say woke. So for example, we would have a lot of group discussions about like oppressor and oppressed. And that's where I first learned words like microaggression and systemic racism, that kind of thing. And this was my first job, and I was very impressed with my peers, and I really wanted to fit in. And I was definitely like very on board with this whole goal of, helping these schools and helping these kids in these neighborhoods. But very early on, I was bothered and uncomfortable with the way the sort of higher ups in this organization were framing our conversations around race. It felt unhealthy. So I really didn't like how I felt like we were being coached to like take offense at a lot of little things and to kind of like sniff out racism, in our peers or in other people. And I really didn't think it was healthy the way my Black peers were kind of, coached to or pushed to kind of dredge up like generational grievances and, interpret sort of benign interactions as like microaggressions. I mean, I can't really think of anything more sort of psychologically abusive than like training people to sort of live in a state of resentment. And I kind of felt like this organization was kind of pushing that on my Black peers. And, of course, if you're white like me, you kind of just like become accustomed to, everyone kind of just like dumps on your race all the time. And, it's, of course, it's like irritating and like not constructive at all, but you kind of like are trained to think that there's something sort of valuable or moral about doing that. And kind of all of this felt to me sort of alien and kind of backwards from the morality I had been raised with, that I thought we'd all been raised with, where you're like supposed to judge people by the content of their character, or like basically like anything except the color of their skin. And sometimes people would say like, hey, like this, shouldn't we be, doing what Martin Luther King said, like judging people by the content of their character? And like, that was one of the wrong opinions. So there were right opinions and there were wrong opinions. And that was one of the ones that you have to learn is a wrong opinion. It would kind of be told something like, in order to like honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, we need to kind of go beyond his prescription of focusing on character, and we need to kind of dig in and really understand how race, informs all aspects of American culture or American institutions. So these things were kind of explained with kind of academic speak that sort of had a patina of plausibility, especially for like a 22-year-old who didn't have any life experience. And I mean, certainly there were kind of nuggets of wisdom that were in there that would kind of like draw you in. And certainly like as a white person, this ideology sort of like breaks you down and kind of breaks down your own sort of trust in your own moral compass, because people are kind of telling you, your opinions aren't really as valid as someone else's because you don't have like the correct like lived experience to fully understand the situation. So needless to say, there was a lot of crying and stress and unhappiness involved with this organization. And as an adult, I look back on that and I'm like, those are clear signs of a toxic work culture. But back then I was naive, we were basically told that our discomfort was like part of the process, or like our discomfort was us clinging to our privilege, or it was like our white fragility. They had all these kind of terms that functioned to normalize the very toxic cognitive dissonance that we were experiencing. And sort of they had all this language that served to kind of make us feel shame and doubt about our doubts, made us feel bad for even like having questions about the things that we were being told. There were also a fair amount of like no-go topics. So for example, you couldn't ever mention anything about how like culture might affect academic performance. So because that would be considered like blaming the victim. So like never mention Asian students, for example, none of that. Another no-go topic was you should not reference any sort of or affirm any sort of generational progress. So, for example, people would get really ruffled if you were to kind of suggest that like maybe racism doesn't play as large a role in our school failures today as like 50 years ago. Like that was like a no-go. And this kind of intellectual gatekeeping was really a red flag for me. Pretty early on, this was something that really got to me, because my feeling is, this is not how you approach a problem when you really want to solve the problem. So the thing that really snapped me out of this whole SJW thing, and frankly, I'm not really sure that I was ever in it, but the thing that really like solidified for me that I did not want to be a part of this way of thinking was my students. So I loved my students, and I had this extremely strong gut instinct that I do not want them exposed to this kind of ideology. This is not going to be good for them. I do not want them entering the world feeling like they are victims. I wanted them to feel like they had this totally bright future, and that, you know, if they just work hard, you know, that it is totally possible for them. And it's not that I did not acknowledge the injustice. I mean, I was massively stressed about sort of the injustice that my kids faced, you know, by dint of attending this like school system that was, you know, totally inferior to the one, say, that like I had attended. But what I didn't want was for them to internalize that as, you know, a reason to give up. So I was very cognizant sort of from the beginning and throughout of